Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Looking at, good morning, world. We are looking at what Jesus did in his life and how he interacted and acted with people and how he handled things. So often we look at what his teachings were, and of course they're incredibly important. I remember the day when I knew some of my brethren said, and I heard them say this, that the New Testament was Acts to Revelation. That Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John were in the Old Testament because Jesus hadn't died and those were under the Old Covenant, so they didn't count. And I thought, you got to be kidding me. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do count. And we're going to be in Luke today. And I want to start in Luke chapter 4. And I thought about trying to get a PowerPoint for the class, but decided that it wasn't worth it because we'll just be looking at scriptures. One of the things I'm learning is as I get older, my voice decides on some days to take a vacation. Some of you know about. So excuse the inconsiderateness of me to have a lozenge in my mouth to keep my throat wet, hopefully. Okay, Luke chapter 4. How do human beings handle temptation? And has anybody ever had a temptation that somebody else hadn't had? And the answer is, 1, Jesus handled temptation. But just as importantly is, he handled all of them that we have in these 3. Y'all do realize there's only 3 sins in the world. There's variations, there's subtitles, there's subparagraphs, there's footnotes, there's all kinds of things with it. But there's 3 sins in the world. And I'll use the old King James version. Lust of the flesh, lust of the eye, and the pride of life. When you look in the Garden of Eden, that was the 3. Lust of the flesh, the fruit looks really good. Lust of the eye, it's very appealing. And the pride of life, if you eat it, you'll be like God. So I've had people tell me, well, you don't know what I'm going through. I may not know the details, but I know what you're going through. I know what you're doing. I know the temptations. I know what you're dealing with. It's kind of like a guy in another town. He called me up. He had been an elder for a congregation in the area. He was no longer, but he still wanted to be. And he had divorced his wife to marry his secretary. And he asked me to come over to his apartment where she was also. I think they had started marriage before they had married. But both of them were very clear. God wants us to be happy. God wouldn't have brought us to this place if he didn't want us to be happy. I said, he's not so much concerned about you being happy as he is about you going to heaven. And what you're about to do is going to hinder that. I didn't say he would be lost because that's not my place, but it was going to make it challenging. And they wanted me to perform the ceremony, and I said, sorry, I can't. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened to them. But in Luke chapter 4, we have the temptation of Jesus, and I want to spend a little bit of time here. This is right after he's been baptized, and I think the juxtaposition is fascinating. He's just been baptized, and then the devil's going to hit him. Rule number 1, whenever you have a spiritual success and things are going really well, Satan's coming to see you. Because he knows that is a moment of weakness. Because we think we have succeeded and everything is wonderful and we're not thinking about the temptation that may arise. So Jesus has been baptized. He's led by the Spirit into the desert. For 40 days he was tempted by that devil. This is in verse 2. He ate nothing during those days, and at the end of them he was hungry. Probably would be. I'm hungry after one day. Or after one missed meal, fill in the blanks. The devil said to him, if you're the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread. Choo! Got a loaf of bread. Jesus answered, it is written, man does not live on bread alone. Devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, I will give you all their authority and splendor, for it's been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. So if you worship me, it will all be yours. What's one of the names of the devil? The father of lies. Yeah. So here's the lust of the eye. all this stuff. And it's fascinating that in this context, the lust of the eye is not another person, it's things, which is just as powerful as flesh. Jesus answered, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." He's the only one that I need to take care of. Devil led him to Jerusalem and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. The Lord has blessed me to go to Jerusalem. The highest point of the temple is called the Pinnacle, and it's on the southeast corner of the Temple Mount on the wall there. And it falls away from there down into the Kidron Valley. And it would be a fall of over 200 feet, about 20 stories or so. So he takes him up to the pinnacle, this corner, this peak there of the geography. And he says, "If you're the Son of God, throw yourself down from here, for it's written, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you carefully. They will lift up your hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Now, interestingly enough, it's my opinion that I think this temptation is probably one of the toughest that people deal with. The temptation to want to be somebody and to be willing to pay the price to be somebody. I was preaching in Van Nuys, and this woman showed up at the door, I don't know, 25 years old maybe. And she said, "I need you to take me to this address." I said, "Well, what's there?" She said, "Bobby Sherman's house." I said, what are you going there for?" "Well, I have talked to him, and he wants me to be into some of his movies or TV shows. I don't remember which." She wanted to be somebody. She had flown from Ohio into Burbank, came to the Van Nuys church. She was wanting to be somebody, and he was going to be the one to make her somebody. I spent the rest of the day talking to her into getting back on a plane and going home. And she did, thankfully. Because I had seen too many people come into LA and come into Hollywood, and Van Nuys at that time was a central place for a lot of acting people. We had several people in the congregation. But I had seen people come out there and their lives just fall apart. Another kid that had been in the church with us in St. Louis, he came out there to be a musician. He got mugged 3 times in Hollywood and lost his instrument every time. Now his dad was wealthy enough to supply him another one, but becoming famous is not all it's cut out to be. But Jesus didn't use that argument about how it's not useful for you or it's not good for you. Jesus said, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test." If he jumps off the pinnacle, that's a test to see if God's going to come save him. I don't know if anybody's in here who said this to me, but a few months ago, somebody said to me about COVID and whether we wore masks or whether we stayed home or whatever. He said, "I trust God. He'll take care of me." I said, "I trust him too, but I'm not going to get out in front of a speeding car." That's what this is. You don't put the Lord to the test. You don't take unnecessary risks just to see if the Lord's going to take care of you. That's nuts, in my opinion. But one of the things God did was he created us with a mind. Put your mind in gear. I've trusted God through this whole process. But I've worn my mask and practiced social distancing till I'm sick of it. We were at a congregation yesterday for a funeral service, and there were hardly anybody there wearing masks. I thought, oh, this is interesting. I wore it in and then when we started singing, I put my mask on, and when we stopped singing, I took my mask off. Because they had decided to go that route. Jesus said, you don't put the Lord to the test. This is how he responded to temptations. And I want to suggest, as a part of our class this morning, that it would be useful for us to imitate Jesus. I heard a guy, C.S. Lewis, one time said, it's probably not wise to try to improve on the Lord. And so the context here is, this is how we face temptation. Okay, we have varying ages in here, so I'm going to ask a question. How many of you still deal with temptations? Well, that's discouraging. I thought I'd grow out of it. That hadn't happened. So we always, no matter what our age is, we have to practice what Jesus demonstrated in this example. How do you deal with temptation? You don't mess with it. The memory comes to mind of Joseph. What did he do when Potiphar's wife grabbed his coat? He ran. He hightailed it out of there. I think sometimes we fail to recognize there's no way to deal with this. I got to get out of here. And there's never any way to deal with temptation except to quote Scripture in the face of the devil, because that's the only outlet we have. Okay. Anybody want to comment on how to face temptation the way Jesus did? This class is not set up for conversation, but we'll survive. Luke chapter 5. This deals with a guy who had leprosy. One of the things your footnotes in your Bible may say that the word here can apply to multiple kinds of skin diseases, whether it's leprosy or something else. But according to the law, of course, any sort of skin disease was counted as unclean. So whether it's real life leprosy or whether it's a skin condition that could be contagious or whatever it may be, most of the time it's translated as leper or leprosy, but it could be anything of a skin nature. Okay, Luke 5, verse 15. Verse 12. While Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground and begged him, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him. Two things I would suggest here. One, people that Jesus listens to are the people who don't make assumptions. They don't say, "I demand you heal me, I demand you clean me, I demand this or this or this." If you are willing, There's a powerful sense of faith that recognizes willingness is as important as doing it. And so he expresses his faith that Jesus can do it, but he recognizes that that the leper is not the most important person in the world. And Jesus is. So if you're willing, Lord, I would like for you to clean me. And then Jesus does something that this guy hasn't had happen in a long time. And I think it's one of the things that calls us to be more aware of others. Jesus reaches out and touches him. It's easy to see that and just pass over it and move on, because we don't get the importance of touching. It is babies die without touching. There's a disease called marasmus. When babies are born and they're left by themselves in the hospital because they don't have anybody to look after them and the nurses can't take care of them enough, they can die within 3 or 4 months because of the lack of touch, as I've been told. Touching is what's killed us in COVID. We haven't touched. I mean, we do this fist bump or, the elbow. And my response is, no offense to anybody, I just do not do anything as do that. That's a sad fake for touching each other and reaching out to each other. And I'm glad that some of us are either had all of our vaccinations or whatever, and we're starting to feel more comfortable in giving each other a hug. But touching is incredibly important. And we see it on several occasions where Jesus touches somebody. He reaches out to them. Now in this case, this guy with the skin diseases had nobody touch him. He was unclean. He had to announce it as he walked through the streets. Unclean, unclean, stay away from me. Nobody can touch me. And that would be a horrible way to live, I would think. One, to announce it, and two, to have to be the one to announce it, putting yourself down by saying, can't touch me. Well, Jesus touched. Jesus reached out. He recognized the importance of connection. Y'all know what I'm talking about? Okay. One of these days I'm going to break out and not have a lecture. Yes?
How do we do that? I fully understand what it meant to that man for somebody to touch him. How does that equate to us?
Hugs, handshakes, salute one another with a holy kiss, go up to somebody in the hospital and put your hand on their shoulder. I have to tell you a story that's not very nice, and it happened to me. I was preaching in a meeting in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a long time ago, and I was illustrating the importance of touch and support, and I walked up behind this individual, and I put my hand on the shoulder of the person and said, just lay your hand on their back. Don't go pat, 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 because pat, 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 Matt says it'll all go away. Well, it may not all go away. They just need support. They need the feel of a touch, of a human connection that can keep them going. And so I was illustrating this. And so this individual was there, and I did that. So I went home. That was Sunday night. I went home with a couple of the elders, with one of the elders, and another elder was there too. And he said, did you know who you were interacting with? I said, no. Kid's mother. He said, well, I'll let Cecil tell you when I'm gone. And I thought, you chicken-hearted. So Cecil told me it wasn't the kid's mother. It looked like the kid's mother, but it was his dad. And the reason I'm saying this is, and the horror story of this is, my immediate reaction was, that's not nice. Touching is reaching out to those who are unclean, or those who, y'all do know what I was talking about when I just, okay. Reaching out to people is anybody. I mean, that individual was unclean to those people because the elder wouldn't even tell me the situation. So I knew something was screwy here, or different at least. I'll better use that word. So touching implies connection. It implies, what's the word? Contact. Could be sacrifice on our part. Acknowledgement. That's a good word. Yeah. Recognition. You're an important person. You're important enough for me to touch, for me to reach out to you. And it's no accident that Paul says in Romans, salute one another with a holy kiss. That doesn't mean a hearty handshake. That's not what he said. He said a holy kiss. I know we want to translate the Bible into ways that fit us, but it's a holy kiss. Now, I know in our country, our culture is not typically we go around kissing each other. I was in Jerusalem, as I'd said, and I was walking down the street, and there were a couple of guys walking along holding hands. If you'd accused them of being something they weren't, they would have cut your throat. Probably. Because in many countries of the world, homosexuality is taboo. They'll put you in jail. When I was in Uganda for a couple of weeks, it quickly became evident they don't look very highly on the United States for the acceptance that the United States has developed. They hold a very narrow view of the practice of homosexuality. But touch is for anybody. And in this case, that's why this is so important, and the example that I just gave you is important, because that person would be, to most of us, unclean. Jesus touched the unclean. He reached out to them. He made a connection with them. Does that somewhere come around your question? And to go back to the word you used, sacrifice, yeah. Sometimes it is a sacrifice to do that. It is a sacrifice sometimes to go into the hospital. I've known people who just terrified of visiting the sick. And I thought, well, you better get ready for it because your mom or dad's going to be there one of these days, and are you going to stay away from them? No, we reach out to them. Now, I don't normally go into the hospitals and put my hand on their shoulders or whatever, but I'm there. Sometimes that can be equal to a touch in terms of presence. So we have to make connection with other people. That's what Jesus did. And that's the lesson that I would hope that we get out of this example of his actions. Any other feedback on that one? Okay, verse 16, same chapter. This is right after the healing of the man with leprosy. Yet the news about him spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Here's the principle I get here. In Christians' lives, there's never enough time to pray. Most of us are too busy to, quote, pray. And what's the problem? Why does Jesus, in the midst of the crowds of people coming to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses, me, I ain't leaving. These people need my help. No, they don't need my help as much as I need my help. There's a principle I learned some years ago that I think is fundamentally important to us. Take care of me, I'm all I've got. Does that sound selfish to anybody? I got one response. It's the most unselfish thing in the world you can do. Let me illustrate. When we lived in L.A., I got chronic fatigue syndrome, and it put me on the deck. For 6 weeks, I was so sick I couldn't even listen to the radio. And I love listening to something. And I didn't have the energy to listen to the radio. When I got to where I could do something, I went to the office and I'd lay on a cot that we put in there for 30 minutes. No, I'd work for 30 minutes and lay down on the cot for 3 hours. I mean, I was devastated with illness during that process. Over about 3 years, it gradually began to diminish a little bit, but there continued to be times when I could feel it coming. It's like an air mattress when you pull the plug on it, and you can just feel the air going out of the mattress. Well, I could feel that happening in my body. I could feel the energy draining out. And I would say to Ann something about, well, it's coming on. And she said, then you go get in bed. And I said, I don't want to get in bed. I didn't probably sound that whiny maybe, but I don't want to go to bed. She said, but we need you to go to bed because we need you to be able to function. That's take care of me, I'm all I've got, is what the principle is. I cannot be available to other people if I don't have the resources in myself to do it. Why does Jesus leave in the middle of all of the demands and all the needy people and all the stuff that's going on, and they need him so badly, and take care of me, I'm all I've got? Now, he doesn't go just do his own hangout retreat. He goes to talk to the Lord, which is sort of important. Jesus is God, right? God praying to God, what is that about? For whatever it means that the Son of God needed to talk to his Father in that relationship and in that connection. And so he would go away in the midst of all of the busyness to take care of himself, to renew his spiritual resources. Sometimes I think we don't put spiritual resources very high on our list of importance. I know this sounds crazy, but since I have not been preaching for 9 years full time, regularly. It's been so easy to lose Bible reading and prayer and so on, because I then realized that most of my life had been spent reading the Bible for a sermon or a class. And that wasn't nice. If you don't have the spiritual resources, you can't cut it. I remember my teacher at Lubbock Christian, Bill Bonoski, used to tell us as preachers, he said, you study, you pray, you prepare yourself so that when you go into the pulpit, you're preaching off the overflow, the stuff that's spilling over the top. That's what you preach and teach. He said, if you ever get down into your bucket, then your resources are going to dry up pretty quickly. And I think that applies to us in all areas of our lives, don't you think? If we let that bucket of spiritual resources start to get low, we won't have much. And that's when the devil hits us, and that's when we get worried and concerned, and how are we going to do this and how are we going to do that? So we keep our spiritual buckets filled up. And Jesus did that by going away to pray. It wasn't a religious event. It was a conversation with God. Y'all do know that prayer is fundamentally conversation with God. It's not a religious event or activity. It's a conversation with God. Sometimes that conversation can break out spontaneously in the middle of whatever's going on. Lord, I'm having a hard time today. Could you kick in here and help me? That's a conversation with God. That's praying. Paul said, pray unceasingly, and that's what we're doing when we do that. We're just with the Lord, and we're walking with Him every day, and things come up, and Lord, I'm having a hard time. I need your help. That's a prayer. And you don't even have to say, in Jesus' name, amen, when you finish it, because you're always praying to Him in the authority of Jesus. Now, I'm not saying we stop saying that most of the time, but there are times when conversation with God is a conversation with God. It's not a ritual that you got to fill in all the blanks. Does that make sense? Lord, deliver us from masks so I can see you. See your reactions. Okay, stay in the same chapter, verse 27. Luke 5:27. After this, after all that's been going on, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. Follow me, Jesus said to him, and Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. Then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his house, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to his disciples, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? Jesus answered them, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. This is more important as we look at it than it might at first seem. Most of our churches are highly cleansed. I heard a story one time. I don't know if this is true, but it's a wonderful story. Congregation of about 500 people. They were gathered. This is before COVID, so they were packed in there together. A young man comes in with long hair, flip-flops, t-shirt, shorts, hadn't shaved in a day or two. And he came into the auditorium, and there was no place to sit. And he walked all the way down to the front, looking for a place to sit. And when he got down there, he just went over and flopped down on the floor and crossed his leg and sat there like an Indian, cross-legged, like a Native American. And all the people were thinking about this guy. He's unkept. He's not dressed appropriately. Who knows where he was last night? All of the things that can come to your head. Hippie, nutcase, all that kind of stuff that can crop up. This old gentleman who had this is some years ago, he had a 3-piece suit on, old man, walked with a cane, gold chain across his vest for his watch. He got up, and the people are thinking, well, it's really too bad, but he's got to go down there and take care of that kid and get him out of here. So he walked slowly down to the front, having to depend on his cane, and he got up to where the young man was, and he sat down with him on the floor and sat there with him the rest of the service. And suddenly the people were shocked. That's what it means to accept the sinner, accept the different person. Most of us, and I probably would be in that category, not very comfortable with the prostitutes and the thieves and all those folks because they're unclean. And we would be contaminated if we got around them. And so we don't get around them. I've often wondered how often would Jesus come to any of our houses to eat. Because he always went to the houses to eat of the sinners, of the folks who were the non-religious, the folks who were on the outside looking in. And that's a challenge to us. It's a challenge to me. I remember working for 6 months up here at Adobe Mountain School, which is a nice sounding name for a juvenile prison. They had double rows of 20-foot high chain link fence, and on the top of both of those was razor wire. To come to work, we had to go through a checkpoint. Went through this one, closed the gate. Went through this one, closed the gate. Had to go through all of our stuff before we could go in. Then we had to exchange our keys to get our key to get in the rooms or to get our radio. And you had to have a radio because you were in there with a bunch of kids who were not known for their obedience to the rules and law. I taught up there for 6 months, but it was the worst experience of second worst experience of my life. Because those kids were something else. And I did not enjoy being around them. Because to be honest with you, I was afraid of them. The reason I got the job was that the teacher who was there, the kids used to take, before they changed the rules, they would take staples out of the papers that were handed back to them. They'd straighten the staple out, then they'd wrap paper around it and got it wet till you had a hard dart. And so there's this 65-year-old woman close to retirement and probably gave it all up because she just quit one day. Because these kids were throwing darts. They weren't throwing it at her, but she never knew whether they were going to or not. They were throwing them into the panels behind her desk. That's the kind of kid that I was working with. I never had any of that stuff. One guy was stabbed by another student with a pencil. So those were called sharps. Before we could end class, we had to collect all the sharps, all the pencils, and count them. It was that kind of place. Well, there were some kids there that I really enjoyed. There were some kids there that I didn't like. There were some kids there that I was afraid of them, just to be plain, bluntly honest. Jesus would have walked into that crowd and who knows? Or he may have walked into the crowd. I'm not going to say what he did. But the point I'm wanting us to see is Jesus ran with a crowd different than the one we run with. Now, he had his inner circle. You have to have your church family to support you. He had the apostles. He had the women. He had the men who followed along with him. It wasn't just 12 running around the country. It was 12 plus several. So he had his support group, but he was not uncomfortable to be present with those who were different than he was. That's a challenge. for us who've grown up the way many of us have grown up. Anybody want to comment on that? That's one we want to leave alone, right? Verse 13 of chapter 7. We looked at this one on Easter Sunday. Chapter 7, pick it up at verse 11. Afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Now, there's something different about the way he says it. The words are the same, but I've seen some of us say, "Don't cry. It's time for you to get over it and get on with your life. It's been 3 months. How much time do you need to go through your bereavement? Let's move on." Well, that's only the non-grieving who would say something stupid like that. People take as much time to go through their grieving as they need to take to go through their grieving. Jesus understands her. Don't cry in the sense of, "I'm going to help you." And he raises the son. But he has compassion. He has an emotional connection with people. When they're hurting, he reaches out to them. And I have to say that through 50 years of ministry, 40 full-time and others, the one thing that I struggled with was building a wall around myself. Let's don't call it a wall, because I could see out and they could see in. Let's call it a plexiglass cage. Because, at least for me, when you're seeing enough suffering, you build a protection. At least I did on many occasions. I'd come home from work and Ann would want me to watch a Hallmark movie about somebody dying. I said, "I don't want to see that." And she thought it was a wonderful movie. I said, "I get enough grief at work without coming home to it." And this was back when I was preaching. This wasn't at the university. The pain and the agony of marriages and families and kids running amok and death and long-term illness and all those things, I would just gradually build up, and over time had and would literally have to take off this plexiglass shield of protection, of emotion. I'm not saying it was good or right, I'm just saying I did it on occasion. I don't know that Jesus ever did that, because he was instantly available to people when they needed him. He made emotional connections. Now, I think when I had to, I got that plexiglass cage off of me where I could reach out to people, but it was difficult. You just kind of build a wall of separation because your emotions can only handle so much. And that's true. There are times when you got to get away, like Jesus did when he went away to pray. What's your feedback to a preacher who builds a plexiglass cage? Oh, there's stunned silence. Yeah. Thank you. You recognize that's a reality and you pray for the preacher, or you pray for the elders. They know stuff preachers don't always know. And they have to keep their mouths shut about it. Sometimes that's what's difficult, because you want to share, not in the way of gossip, but you want to share the load. They cannot share the load. I know God's given me things through the years that I can't tell anybody till after I die, because of things that have happened to people and confidences you have to carry. That becomes a challenge. Now, the beautiful thing about Jesus is he dealt with all of those situations and was constantly available to them. One final one. We can do this in 3 minutes. John chapter 7, verse 20. This is a beautiful insight into what can really happen. Jesus has been teaching all over the place. He's become well known. He's honored. People are giving him all the attention. John's disciples, John the Baptist is in jail. John's disciples told him about all these things. Calling 2 of them, he sent them to the Lord to ask, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" That's a discouraged man. I understand him. I was out of preaching for 10 years. There are times when I look back over those years and wonder, did I ever accomplish anything? And about the time I'm thinking that, somebody shows up and say, "I remember this." And it's very encouraging. But John is in a discouraged place. He's in jail. He's going to lose his head pretty soon. He doesn't know it yet, but he's going to. And they come to Jesus and ask him that question. And in Matthew chapter 11, Jesus says, "You go tell John this. He cured many who had diseases, sicknesses, and evil spirits, and gave sight to many who were blind." He replied to the messenger, "Go back and report to John what you've seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor." That's what Jesus did for John. When you know someone who's discouraged, give them upbeat information. When you're around somebody who's depressed, give them some upbeat information. Tell them what God is doing. Now that requires us to keep up with what God's doing in our own lives, doesn't it? How many of you take an inventory ever so often and say, "I remember that. That's what God did during that point"? I can look back over life and there's numbers of times when I can say, "Well, I didn't know it at the time, but God did this. He provided this. He gave this. He did this." The way I did it was look at the checkbook. You go back several years in your checkbook and you can start looking at how low your balance was on occasion. And you realized, we still survived. We still made it. Money still showed up. God does take care of us. So for us to be able to help other people, we need to stay in contact ourselves with the awareness of what God's done for us. I think there's a song about that. Y'all remember that song? Count your many blessings, name them one by one. We sing it. We haven't sung it here in forever, if ever, since I've been here. But count your many blessings is something that's very useful to do. Because on days when we're very discouraged and down and life feels like it's caving in on us, look back over what God's done for you and count the times He has bailed you out. And that's what He's doing with John the Baptist. He's saying, go back and tell John his work was good, his work was successful, and I'm the fulfillment of your work. You weren't a failure. Sometimes we need to say that to each other. Okay, my watch says 10:15. There's no kids at the door and nobody waiting to get in, but it's still time to stop. Y'all do know that when you have Bible hour and they let the Bible hour kids out before you're through preaching, it's time. You've been too long.